Let's get 'em, boys! Let's storm the Bastille. Let them eat cake. Let us reform our society for the greater good of the people. Let's suppress the peasants. And of course suffer the inevitable rise of said peasants and overthrow of the government. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host Marie Mullaney. Today I want to discuss political reform or revolution as part of a fantasy world, either in its history or as a major plot point. If you enjoy this kind of fantasy world building content, hit the subscribe button down below, and if you want to join my community of world builders, link to the Discord server is in the description. Okay, let's get cracking. So why do I want to discuss revolution and reform in the same breath? Because you won't have a revolution if you have not had attempts at forcing reform. And if you have had reform, you are much less likely to have a revolution. So how I want to approach today's discussion is in terms of the events that lead to a revolution in a timeline, and where and when a revolution can be avoided. Revolution always follows a kind of timeline. There is the people getting suppressed, then there is the people agitating for reform. This is generally driven by some of the ruling class also standing with the people and trying to force that reform. Then there is the reforms failing to gain traction or the reforms not being sufficient. And then eventually there is a triggering event that causes a general uprising that results in a revolution. Now, a revolution is different from a rebellion. A rebellion is when one ruler is replaced by another ruler. A coup is when one ruler is replaced by another, but it's all kind of internal politics. There isn't a mass mobilization. A revolution is when your system of government changes. It is not one king being replaced by another king. It is a king being replaced by a democracy, or a democracy being replaced by an emperor. So that is what a revolution is, and it is a slow process to get there, slower than a rebellion. So first I want to talk about what would make reform successful. And in order to do that, I'm going to talk about two examples in our world where political reforms were enacted and the reasons why they were successful, obviously, in my opinion. My first example is Emperor Justinian of Byzantium. Now, Emperor Justinian in 535 changed the laws around governorships. Previously, governorships could be bought, and those governors would then go to their principalities, which they'd bought the governorship for, and they would seek to recoup their investment in their title, basically by gouging it out of the skin of the people who lived in that principality. This, of course, led to enormous unhappiness in those provinces. Now, what Justinian did was he very simply forbade the sale of governorship, and this was a major reform. Now, I'm not saying that Justinian's reforms are the only reason the Byzantium Empire lasted until 1435, but they were certainly a massive contributing factor in the empire lasting that long, because that decline of corruption in the provinces very clearly told the people that they were being listened to. But you can see how early Justinian got ahead of the problem. Like, he didn't wait until the provinces were in revolt already, or he had armies marching on Constantinople. No, he acted fast. He acted early. And that is worth remembering. If you want reforms in your world to be successful, the earlier you act, the better it will be. The other example of successful reform that I want to speak about is the development of democracy in Athens. Way back when, Athens was not a democracy. It was basically an oligarchy. A couple of rich families ran everything. But the peasants were not happy. People were in massive debts. Peasant farmers couldn't make ends meet. They had to sell their families into slavery to feed other parts of their family. So they would literally sell children in order to feed other children, which is a brutal way to exist. And in the meantime, the nobles of Athens were, living it up and wealthy and getting wealthier. And the people objected. But instead of not listening, in the end, a guy called Solon was given powers by the archons of Athens to make necessary reforms. Now, Solon's reforms were not yet democracy, but they did lay some foundations for it. What he did was he made the positions of archon more accessible. Anybody could stand for archon. He also put it so that people were selected for archon, like they stood as candidates, then their names went into a hat, and from those candidates somebody random was drawn. This immediately reduced the level of money in Athenian politics, as you couldn't guarantee anyone's appointment because it was randomly selected. He also created the Great Assembly. He divided Athens into these 4 classes, and 100 of their members were selected from each of these classes to form the ball. These guys determined what would go before the assembly to be voted on by the people in an open vote by raising their hands. Obviously, this was still heavily weighted in the favor of the rich. Why? Because the rich made up 3 of the classes, so they contributed 300 members to the bowl, whereas the poor, the peasants, only made up 1 of the classes. But still, Solon's reforms did help. They did not go quite far enough. People were still in debt. There were still issues. But they did lay a foundation. That foundation was built upon by Cleisthenes, I hope I pronounced that name correctly, who is called the father of Athenian democracy. Now, this guy realized that the problem was that Athenian democracy favored the rich. So what he did was he split Athens into 10 tribes based on geographic location. Each of these tribes then selected 50 members to go to the expanded bowl, and that removed the bias towards the rich and put in place a representative democracy. You would elect from your tribe somebody to represent you in the government of your country. And this made people see the government as fair. Any person could stand for election, but you could only serve 2 terms in the bowl, and they had to be separated by 10 years. Also, the Athenians built a release valve into their democracy. What they did was every year they would have a special general assembly where you would write the name of the person you disliked most in Athens on a piece of pottery shard. You would etch it in, and then you would dump that in a pot. And if somebody got more than 6,000 votes, they were ostracized. They had to leave Athens for a 10-year period. They were basically banished for 10 years. And this was a way to get disliked people out of politics, which I think is a very interesting mechanic. These reforms built on the previous reforms by Solon, and they very successfully created the first representative democracy, and not only a representative democracy, but a government that lasted for centuries, and a government that created a great deal of stability. Again, you can see that the reforms worked early in the process. People were unhappy. Reforms started. The reforms weren't quite enough. There were still issues. The reforms were increased, built upon, made more robust. And that is the key to a successful reform. The earlier you start the process, the easier it is to reform. The later you leave it, the more you have to do and the faster you have to do it. The Athenians could take years with their reforms, gradually making the changes they needed because they had time. But if they had waited until the mob was in the street, they would not have had time, and they would probably have had to reform really fast. If you enjoyed that discussion around reforms in the political process and things to think about when you're building them into your world, hit the thumbs up button. And let's talk about missed opportunities on the path of revolution. If we're going to talk about missed opportunities, we have to talk about the Russian Revolution. First, a little bit of context. The Russian peasants were very unhappy before the revolution started, and I mean very. Everywhere else in Europe, peasants had been freed. Peasants were no longer serfs, they didn't belong to the land, they were free to move around as they wished. Absolute monarchies had basically fallen by the wayside. Everything was either a democracy or a constitutional monarchy. But in Russia, the absolute monarchy persisted in the shape of the Tsar. Now, Tsar Alexander II had every opportunity to make reforms, and indeed he did start making those reforms. Besides being the Tsar of Russia, he was also the King of Poland and the Grand Duke of Finland. He had granted Poland a constitution. He had granted Finland a constitution. In those two countries, it was in fact a constitutional monarchy, but not in Russia. In Russia, the Tsars maintained absolute power. Now here is where you get to the real missed opportunity. Alexander could have freed the peasants. He had absolute power. But the entrenched interests in Russia was in his nobility. And let me tell you something. If there is a greatest love affair in all of the world, it is the entrenched interests or the powers that be and their love affair with the status quo. It is the love story of the ages. So, in order to keep his nobles happy, Alexander freed the peasants, but in order to compensate the nobles for the loss of their labor, the peasants owed the nobles such a humongous amount of money they would never be able to repay it. So he freed them, but it meant nothing because they were just debt slaves now instead of being serfs. So instead of being tied to the land, they were now in such debt they could never do anything with their supposed freedom. So Alexander had a real opportunity to make reforms, but he didn't. He squandered it. And then he died because the people became even more unhappy when they saw his fake freedom, so he was assassinated. This then turned his son and heir against making any further reforms, and eventually that turned Tsar Nicholas against making any further reforms, and Tsar Nicholas, of course, was the poor sucker who presided over the Russian Revolution. And of course, the Russian Revolution was eventually hijacked by Lenin and it gave rise to the Soviet Union. So there was a real moment when there could have been reforms that could have changed the course of history. Missed opportunity right there. And that is something to bear in mind if you do want a revolution. It is key to build in those moments where there could have been reform. And they just weren't taken. Why? Maybe the status quo was too strong. Maybe the entrenched interest had too much on your ruler. Maybe your ruler just couldn't get the support he needed. But for whatever reason, the opportunity was missed and revolution resulted. And if you liked that discussion on missed opportunities on the road to revolution, hit the thumbs up button. And let's talk about reforms that go the wrong way. So in order to talk about reforms that go the wrong way, I'm going to talk about the fall of the Roman Republic. Not the empire, that was a whole different thing. The Republic. So when the Republic became an empire. Julius Caesar famously is the dude who dragged the Roman Republic out back and stabbed it till its corpse lay bleeding on the floor and his son could become the emperor of Rome. But he wasn't the guy who started the rot. The problem was that the Republic had started rotting from the inside. And this was predominantly caused by the fact that they were too successful. They had conquered many territories, they had brought a lot of slave labor back to Rome, that those slave labor enabled the patricians to farm massive estates without needing the plebeians. And as they became richer and they no longer needed the plebeians, they kind of let the plebeians fall by the wayside, and the poor people, and these plebeians, or the poor, the normal working class people, basically were starving. Then Marius reformed the Roman army, and he removed the need for there to be a property ownership associated with being a soldier. So the plebeians flocked to joining the army because it was a way to gain both citizenship and land. But because of the way that Rome was rotting from the inside, what was happening back home is that their little farming plots were being gobbled up by the patricians and their massive slave-run estates. Then along came a dude called Sulla. Now this dude led an army on Rome, and he took over as dictator. Now by the time that he'd come along, we'd had the Gracchi brothers, who were the first to get murdered, and that kind of ushered in an era of political violence. Previous to this, Rome had not known political violence. But with the death of the Gracchi, it became normalized, and political violence thus became a thing. So when Sulla marched on Rome, it was kind of like the pinnacle of political violence. Okay, so he took over, but then he was horrified by the fact that he'd taken over. He was a staunch Republican, and he tried to strengthen the Republic by putting in place a whole bunch of rules about being consul and senator, and he basically reformed the Republic in the wrong direction. Instead of addressing the real issues, which was that in Rome, the plebeians and the patricians, the inequality between the two had grown to unsustainable levels. The plebeians were starving and they didn't have enough rights in their government. They didn't have enough contribution into their government. And instead of addressing the fact that there could no longer be change in the Roman government because the government got gridlocked the whole time because of the competing interest of the status quo and the wealth of the senators. So instead of addressing any of those things, Sulla chose to instead address the icing on the cake and try and strengthen the patricians' hold on power, because he was like, that's the problem. We're not good, strong Roman morals anymore. We need more of those. And so he tried to make those morals in law. And what he really did was he showed a blueprint to young Julius Caesar of how you can take an army and march into Rome and take hold of Rome and make the changes you want to make. And that in the end is exactly what Julius did. He actually did make the reforms that should have been made. He did address the wealth inequality gap. He did address the fact that people were starving. He was beloved by the people because of that. But he did also, in the process, utterly destroy the Republic, because he just became dictator for life, and that was that. Of course, he was then murdered, but the people of Rome were so enraged by his murder that they stood behind Antony, and eventually Augustus became the first actual emperor of Rome. If you enjoyed that discussion about reforms going the wrong way and definitely bringing about revolution, hit the thumbs up button. And let's go through that step-by-step process of the road to revolution by looking at the French Revolution. So the first thing that you should know about the French Revolution is that they are the poster boy for status quo and it being maintained by the powerful elite. Queen Marie Antoinette was known as Madame Deficit because she would spend money like water while France was so in debt They had taxes on personal income, taxes on salt. The church demanded tithes. The peasants were being taxed to the point where they had barely anything. And the nobility was living the rich life in Versailles, and I mean living the rich life. Then there came the triggering event, which was a natural disaster. The harvest failed. Now the peasants were really starving, and the riots started. The king, Louis, was like, okay, let me diffuse the situation, and I will call the National Assembly. Now, the National Assembly consisted out of the three estates. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobility, and the third estate was everybody else. Each one of these had one vote. Despite the fact that this one represented everyone, they could be outvoted by these two. And so, the entrenched interests of the nobility and the priesthood prevented any form of reform. Now, our third estate didn't immediately turn to revolution. Instead, they said, we're going to try and form our own government for Paris because everybody supports us. And so they did. And Louis wouldn't allow this, so he locked them out of their building. They then went and found an indoor tennis court where they took the tennis court oath about continuing to meet and creating this government for France with all these reforms. But within this meeting of the Third Estate, the Jacobean faction was already growing, and the Jacobean faction didn't just want reform, they wanted revolution. So you can see that Louis already had two opportunities for reform, but both of them were missed. Now you had this tennis court government. And here is where Louis made his fundamental mistake in going the other way. He summoned the army, and he had the army surround Paris. And that, of course, created immense fear in the Third Estate, who were running Paris at this point. And you know what they say about fear? It leads to anger. And the Third Estate expressed that anger by recruiting the people from the street to face the army. Except that the army experienced a large amount of defections who joined the Third Estate because they were also unhappy with the king. And then they stormed the Bastille and stormed Versailles, and there were a lot of guillotines, and then there was Maximilian Robespierre, and then there was the Reign of Terror. And there were all the missed opportunities in the world where Louis could have made meaningful change, but he did not have the courage to face down the entrenched interests. He didn't have the strength to do so, and hence it eventually became revolution. And if you enjoyed that discussion of the path of revolution and the missed opportunities and the reforms in the wrong direction, hit the thumbs up button. And those were my thoughts on revolution and reform and its application to fantasy worlds. If you enjoyed this video, you'll probably enjoy my video on rebellions, which you can find in the card over there, or any of the other videos on my channel. And if you would like to support me in making more of these videos, link to my Ko-fi page or my book down below in the description. And I will see you soon for another video.